Our next speaker is Ed Stringham, and so we're going to move from trade policy to high finance, I think.
Hi, finance. I'm living in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York, so a lot of my examples are going to come from that. I do live a couple blocks away from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and I'm going to start with a true story of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from February 4th, 2016. It's a Friday, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York gets some messages from some hackers posing as officials from the Bank of Bangladesh. Hello, could you please send me $961 million to some private accounts in Philippines and Singapore? Okay. They start transferring these things. $100 million going into this one in Sri Lanka, and another $81 million going to a private account that had never been used before in the Philippines. And one of the routing banks, Deutsche Bank, was looking at this and like, I don't know, this looks a little bit suspicious. Why are we sending this $100 million to this thing, the Malika Foundation? There was even a typo in the foundation. And the Deutsche Bank was like, maybe we should call the Bank of Bangladesh, see if it's really them. Well, it turns out Friday is a weekend in Bangladesh. So they're off, doing their thing. And so Deutsche Bank stopped $100 million of transfers. And meanwhile, $81 million had already been transferred to private accounts in the Philippines, withdrawn, and spent on casino chips. Impossible to track down casino chips. The money's gone. It will never be recovered. And the reason I mention this example is to show the problem of fraud. If two large governmental organizations have to deal with fraud like that, and in many cases, there's nothing they can do about it, what does that mean to the average person, to the average merchant, the average small business person? What I'm going to do is highlight how this is a universal problem throughout history, but I'm going to highlight how private parties often figure out private solutions to the problem of fraud. Things that we often assume that only the government can do or should do are actually solved privately by entrepreneurs for profit throughout history and in modern times. I'll give you a quick, this is a sad story. I've got this book, Private Governance. It's not as well selling as Bob Lawson's best-selling book. I can't tell the name of it because it has a swear word in it. So instead, you should buy Private Governance by Edward Stringham. I got an order to a customer in Turkmenistan. And I was like, great, $45, I'm rich. Send the book, and I'm like, great. Now I'm also going to get a review on Amazon in Turkmenistani. My life is made. A month later, I got a chargeback from the credit card company. So I shipped it to a fraudulent buyer with a stolen card. So what have I done? Well, I hired my lawyer in Hartford, And he's trying to establish whether the lawsuit is going to take place in Hartford or in Turkmenistan. So I also hired a lawyer in Turkmenistan, and they're discussing that. And what we've done, we've started to initiate legal proceedings in Turkmenistan. I only need to fly over there about twice per year for this trial, which my lawyers assure me will be wrapped up within the next 10 years. So all is not lost. A theme in my remarks today are going to be that many things that we assume the government can solve, it's an assumption. And in many cases, it's not a true assumption. It's a made-up assumption. Some of you might be aware of the literary term deus ex machina. Anybody heard this term? Where you've got this poorly written novel and everything's terrible, it's awful, what are we going to do? Everything's bad. And at the very end, God is wheeled in on a machine. This is an ancient Greek plays. Athena comes in. She's like, oh, okay, here, I'm going to solve all your problems. The end. Oh, thanks. Great. A lot of people criticize this as an unrealistic plot twist in Greek plays and also in modern movies starring Keanu Reeves. This also, I think, is a major feature of public policy debate, of economic debate, specifically about regulation. So there's oftentimes a problem, and the proposal is, okay, well, all we need to do is we'll just pass Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and then there'll be no future downturn. Don't worry about it. Oh, there's another downturn. Oh, we're just going to pass Dodd-Frank. Don't worry about it. It's only 20 times longer than War and Peace. It's not even a problem. So you add on tons and tons of regulations, which end up being very costly, I would argue very damaging towards the economy, in many cases with zero efficacy. There's still going to be problems, however. And what I'm going to highlight is when there is an existing problem, an extant problem, a remaining problem, private parties are either going to have to deal with it, just lose money from it, or in many cases, private parties are going to take steps to eliminate their problems and profit by doing so. So I'm going to highlight when private parties historically have solved important problems to eliminate things like fraud and unintentional default in history. Our theme today is what can we learn about history? So I'm going to highlight some examples from financial history and then talk about their relevance today. The world's first major stock market, does anyone know where that was? All right, yes. 17th century Amsterdam, they created these ventures, which eventually turned into what was called the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company financed Henry Hudson, who found New Amsterdam, Manhattan, and later on, the second company, the Dutch West India Company, founded New Amsterdam, which now is unfortunately called New York. We're trying to change the name back to New Amsterdam. So they traded this as, basically a trading post to focus on profit. And meanwhile, there were a lot of riches created in Holland. It was the first time in history where painting started becoming of everyday life, not just of royalty, not just of mythology. there was a huge explosion of the amount of people who had art in their homes. We think about this as the Dutch Golden Age. We have Vermeer, Rembrandt, all these great people. Now, the East India Company was originally created as a temporary venture where they were just going to dump a bunch of investors' money into this pot. They're going to go to India or Indonesia specifically, and the voyage was going to come back, and they're going to distribute the profits. Well, it turns out it was a really successful set of first ventures, and they said, well, let's just keep sending the profits out again to continue these ventures. And after a few years, it's like, well, that's about 10 years. They're like, we're just going to have this as an ongoing venture. So the equivalent of a modern corporation. It's called the joint stock company at the time. So they started paying people profits, and they started allowing people to cash out their shares based on how much you had put in. Initially, there was 3,000 shares, but you could own fractions of shares. And to do that, you have to go to the company's offices. So like the equivalent of like, hey, Bill Gates, can I sell my shares in Microsoft, please? Come on in, take a seat, sit down. And that was possible, but it was very time-consuming. The company wasn't really set up to do that. And so a new profession emerged of stockbrokers. There were commodity brokers already at the Amsterdam Bourse, and some of them started specializing in stock brokerage, where they would keep a ledger of two people who wanted to trade their shares, and they would let people trade their shares actually multiple times, and they would settle them once per quarter in what they call the rescompte. And so these trades that now we have about 3-day settlement. You make a stock transaction, you get the cash 3 days later, typically. It was the same thing, but this was quarterly. That basically meant that these were a forward contract, almost the equivalent of a futures contract, because we're making a contract now, and we're going to settle it 3 months from now. Now, the result of this was it solved the problem where you didn't have to go to the company's offices. The problem with this is, what happens if somebody disappears? You got 3 months where you've got to worry about the counterparty disappearing. And in many cases, the counterparty might unintentionally default or intentionally default and say, did we make a transaction? That was 3 months ago. Tim, I don't think we made a transaction. I don't even remember what I was doing yesterday, 3 months ago. I'm sorry. So now my counterparty is out of luck anytime somebody walks away. They had also, in 17th century Amsterdam, you could go long on these transactions. You could go short on these transactions. You could be a seller without actually having the shares when you make the transaction. And you have to buy settlement date, buy these shares, and then deliver them. Well, anytime there's a short sell, you say you want price to go down, you buy the shares in the future at this low price, and then you give it to the person here. Well, in the short run, if the price zooms up, one of the problems with short selling, or two short sellers, is now they've got to buy. They were hoping the price was going to go down. They've got to buy at this really high price and then deliver here. They might not be able to afford it, even if they wanted to. There's nothing they can do to deliver. It's called naked shorts. And so this was very confusing to a lot of people. And officials at the time were like, what are you guys even doing? I don't understand any of this. This is like way too confusing, and this looks like gambling. So the government actually said, stop, don't do it. it's illegal, and if at settlement date I don't want to settle, I could say, you know what, the law says I don't have to deliver. And people could do that. It was called appeal to Frederick, after this politician named Frederick Henry. So the law said you didn't need to deliver on any of these transactions. And so if we assume that markets are only made possible because of law and because of regulators, what's going to happen? The market's going to disappear. No more stock market. The market just, they passed a law, and the market just disappeared. Is that what happened? No. People did it anyway. People are like, okay, whatever. The law says we're not supposed to do this, but we're going to do this because we want to. And I'll tell you why. They delivered in a minute. But they also had other very advanced types of transactions. They had so forward contracts, short sales. They developed a market for options. Calls and puts, where you have the opportunity but not the obligation to buy or sell certain shares. That also was illegal. They thought that was a form of gambling. They referred to all of this as trading in wind. You're not allowed to be making transactions in things that you're not settling within 2 weeks. So all these things were illegal. People did it anyway. They also had something called ducaton shares, where they would basically slice up shares into 1/1000th of a share. And rather than actually trading the share, it was called the payment of difference contract. So if the share started out at $1 and it went up to $1.10, we don't have to give each other $1.10, and the share we just settle for 10 cents. Okay? That was also illegal. Nevertheless, the market thrived. And why was it? It was profitable. People wanted to do it. So that was the good part. When something's profitable, people want to do it, and they're going to do it. They're going to figure out ways to do it. And now the question is why? Zoom forward, 1998. I worked at Fidelity on a trading floor. And part of what my job was to do was we were dealing with these what are called pink sheets, which are illiquid shares, in many cases that had been delisted. And you couldn't automate them at the time. And so our desk would have to take these quotes over the phone and then call in and find a market maker in these things. And it's entirely easy to mishear either side. Did that person say buy 100 shares, sell 100 shares? They say limit order of 5/8, 7/8. So most transactions went smoothly, the vast majority of them. But at any given time, some of them are going to go wrong. And we were obligated to make sure that the customer got exactly what the customer owed. We couldn't say to the customer, oh, sorry, we misheard the order. Customer gets what the customer is owed, whether or not the agency trading desk where I was or the market makers misheard something that was irrelevant. Okay, so part of my role is to figure out why something didn't get filled at the right time, the right price, and we had to rectify it. So what would I do? I would call up the counterparty and we said buy 100 shares, and you thought we said sell 100 shares. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to call the cops on you. We're going to court. I'm going to sue you. And I would do that 100 times per day. Is that what I did? Why not? Okay, it's not good business. Adam Smith talked about what we call in modern times a reciprocity and the discipline of continuous dealings. When people interact 100 times in a day, they need to be reliable. They need to make sure they're going to follow through with their order. And that's how this market worked in 17th century Amsterdam. I'm going to mention a couple other quick examples moving forward, because there's a surprising amount of similarity. Moving forward to the next major stock market, London, basically 100 years later, same story. They were kicked out of the Royal Exchange and thought they were unruly, the stockbrokers, and so they had to trade in coffee houses around what was called Change Alley. They traded in a coffee house called Jonathan's Coffee House, another one called Garraway's Coffee House. Same story, based on the discipline of continuous dealings. However, as the market started getting bigger, started attracting more unreliable parties, and still exposing people to default. So what they started to do is said, let's create a set of private rules and regulations in this coffee house. We're gonna put the defaulter's name on a blackboard. We're going to eventually turn this into a private subscription room. We're eventually going to turn it into a private club called the Stock Exchange, now known as the London Stock Exchange, where they now have as their motto, my word is my bond. So this is a private rules and regulation providing organization. Closer here, New York, Tontine Tavern and Coffee House. See, that's why we were better. We added the tavern part. Same thing, they adopted as a constitution a set of rules. You had to, things about not defaulting. No swearing, no standing on tables. That's why we're better than the English people. That's right. Later, the New York Stock and Exchange Board, that was the subsequent more formal version of this, now known as the New York Stock Exchange, started having more rules and regulations, disclosure requirements. By the time the Securities and Exchange Act was implemented, said, oh, you need to have disclosure requirements. New York Stock Exchange was like, but we're already doing that. We're already doing that. Said I have 2 more hours left? Okay. You're tough, Bob. I'll just give you one last quick example, 1 minute. Does anybody here hire any provider of private rules and regulations? Have any direct relationship right now? I'm going to say every single person here, International Swaps and Derivatives Association, holds every single stock that everybody owns in this room. It's basically there protecting our money. There's a really cool story from the flood, Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, where their basement got flooded. All of these stock certificates, most of them are electronic at this point. They're still stock certificates sometimes. And they had to bring in these armed guards, and they basically saved all of these stock certificates. They actually flew them in, drove them in frozen ice trucks down to Texas, where they got them freeze-dried and brought back to New York. So all this stuff works behind the scenes. We don't even know it, but for profit, we've got financial intermediaries. When I wake up in the morning, I say, thank goodness for financial intermediaries. I'm so grateful for all these financial intermediaries for making the modern world possible. Thank you.
We have about time for 1 or maybe 2 questions if they're short.
I just want, and I don't know if you can do this in minutes, but the foreign exchange market, my recollection is it started in Venice or something, and it's just people that were trading in a square to set foreign exchange across the world.
Yes, that's my understanding is Venice and Genoa were the first financial centers before Antwerp and Amsterdam. So I'm less knowledgeable about foreign exchange markets. But yeah, those are the precursors, the first financial world financial centers that have made everything possible. All right, well, thank you very much.